Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. As many of you know, my name is Prue Klein. I'm the Marketing Manager here at Wine Communicators of Australia. Today's webinar will be presented by James West, Behavioural Psychologist at Wine Australia. James will explore the myths of behavioural change, some techniques for changing behaviour, and see how behavioural insights have been applied in other industries and how you can perhaps apply this behavioural science to your own wine business. We've allowed plenty of time for any questions you may have to be answered at the end of James's webinar. However, feel free to send them through to me as they come to mind. You can do this via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. As usual, this webinar is recorded and a recording will be sent to you 24 hours after today. It is now my pleasure to hand over to you, James, for today's presentation.
Thank you very much, Prue. Thank you for the lovely introduction as well. We'll talk about introductions a bit later, actually, as one of the techniques we'll be looking at. So I've titled today's presentation about the science and a little bit of the art of behavioural change. So I work in a field that is, I'm from a psychology background, but I work in a field called behavioural economics, which looks at, economists think that everybody is motivated by money and only money. And then starting in the 1970s, a lot of psychologists came along and said, actually, there are a lot of other things that motivate people. We're not motivated for purely economic reasons. There are lots of other reasons that people do things. And so the field that kind of emerged out of that over the last 20 years is called behavioral economics. You may know of someone like Daniel Kahneman, who wrote a best-selling book called Thinking Fast and Slow a few years back. He's kind of considered the founder of this field. And you may have heard of it as called nudge theory, or you may have heard about behavioral insights teams. A lot of governments use psychologists and economists to look at how people behave and how we can nudge people to behave in better ways. So I'll be talking about what some of those nudges are. I'll be looking at one of my case studies, so taking you through how it looks when you actually apply it in the field as well. So if I can make the screen work. So what I'd like to do first is talk you through the science behind behavioral economics. So I'm going to look at three myths about behavioral change. So traditionally, when we do change management processes or practices, we think that people are rational. We think that if we change people's minds, then they will change their behavior. And we think that if we ask people why they do what they do, that they actually are able to tell us. But what most of the research seems to indicate is that our behavior is automatic. And we're not actually very rational. We behave in ways that react to the environment, and we do things that we're told to do, and we do things that our friends are doing. And there's lots of other reasons why we do what we do. I'd then like to take you through three kind of broad categories of what we call nudges. So one of them will be reciprocity. So you will feel an obligation to do something back for me if I have done something nice for you in the first place. We'll look at authority, so our tendency to obey people who are in authority or who we perceive as being in authority. And then finally, the principle of similarity. So we like people who are similar to us. And what I'll be taking you through in those points is explaining to you what they are, what they look like, and giving you some examples from the research literature. And then the last part will be around more about the art of behavioral science. So it's all well and good to know how it works in a university setting or in a lab experiment, but how does it work actually when you're out in the field or when you're designing a new product or service or whatever it is. So I'll talk about, some of the factors you should consider in the art of it, and then I'll look at one of my case studies, which was with a large utility company in the UK, Anglian Water, one of the big 12 utility companies in the water industry over there. So that's what we're going to cover in the next hour. A couple of things. If you have any questions, if you want to just put them into the chat box, and then we'll have a chance at the end to talk about questions, or I can give you some advice on particular things you might want. But also, as we go through, I will probably stop and ask you to think of any examples you've seen of this happening, or you can, I'll get you to write a couple of messages about how you might try and influence behavior based on what I've been talking about. So let's look at the three big myths of behavioral change. Okay, so the first one is that information is persuasive. So usually when we do communications and we're writing out to people, we think that if people know the facts, they will change what they do. So we think that information by itself will be persuasive. whereas a behavioral economist thinks it's the way you present information, it's who presents the information to you that have a much larger impact on what you will do differently. The second myth is that we think if we change someone's minds, we think that if we're rational and we're logical and we argue with people, then changing people's minds will change their behavior. What actually happens is that we have quite a lot of disagreement between what we believe and what we actually do. And a lot of the behavioral science evidence seems to be that if you change people's behavior, it will change their minds, but changing their minds doesn't usually change their behavior. And then the final one is what economists call stated versus revealed preferences, which is if you ask people what they're going to do, that they will be able to tell you that that's why they have done something, whereas revealed preferences is what you see when people are actually behaving. Most of us are not logical and rational. If people ask us why we've done something, we will make up a story to say why we've done what we've done, which is not necessarily the main reason we've done something. I'll give you a few examples of these as we go along. So the first one is that information is not persuasive. We think if we give people more information, we give them data, we give them something, they will change their minds, as long as they have the correct information. So here's a really famous study in a field called motivated reasoning, which is about why we do what we do. They asked 1,200 people to complete a maths test. So before the maths test, they're given a basic numeracy test to check how numerically advanced they are. They're also given a survey of their political beliefs. So what do you believe about hot button issues like abortion, like capital punishment, like immigration, refugees, etc., etc. And then people are asked to complete this maths test. So they go through the maths test, and somewhere in the maths test, there is this question. And it's a question about a new skincare cream that's come out, and they've tested it on people, and this is the results they got. So the patients who used the new skin cream, 223 got better and 75 got worse. Patients who did not use the new skin cream, 107 got better and 21 got worse. So there's something here called the big numbers fallacy. So if you're not particularly numerical, you will think that actually the skin cream worked really well because a lot of people got better when they used the skin cream. But actually, if you do the ratios and the percentages, you'll realize that actually the skin cream didn't work any better than a placebo. And you'll be pleased to know that the very numerate people got the answer correct. So they could do the test, and all the people who were highly numerate understood that actually the skin cream doesn't work. So then later on, as they're going through the test, they get another question. But this time, instead of being a question that's neutral about skin cream, they got a question about capital punishment or abortion or refugees or whatever the issue might be. So as you can see, in this case, I've used refugees as an example. So in cities that allow refugees to settle, you have this much increase in crime and this much decrease in crime. And cities that banned refugees from settling, the same things. So in this question, the numbers are exactly the same as they were in the previous question about skincare. Okay, so they should be able, the people who are highly numerate should be able to do answer the question in exactly the same way that they answered it before. What actually happens, however, is that if they got the skin cream question right the first time, if the refugee question agreed with their political beliefs, they got the answer right again. However, if it disagreed with their political beliefs, most of the people got the answer wrong. So we know that they can do the math. That's not the problem. The problem is that their political beliefs, their motivated reasoning, is actually interfering with their ability to do the maths problem, to do the logical thing. And if this experiment has been done hundreds of thousands of times now, it's very famous in social psychology. And if it doesn't terrify you a lot, then I probably haven't explained it well enough. So basically what will happen is more information, more logic doesn't actually help in terms of making decisions. So not only did the people have all the answers they needed to get the question right, they had already done the maths early in the paper. But as soon as it became something they were personally involved with or something they had a vested interest in, they now got the answer wrong. And one of the scary things about this is the more numerate they were, the more likely they were to get the answer wrong. So even really clever people will get the answer wrong if it goes against their prior beliefs and judgments. So information is not persuasive. Just giving people lots of information, teaching them how to do things, think logically, etc., doesn't actually change how they behave or how they answer questions. So the second main myth, changing minds equals changing behavior. And there's a thing in psychology called moral licensing, which means that if I do something good, I will give myself permission to do something bad afterwards. So classic example, I've been to the gym, I can have an extra donut afterwards because I've already burned off those calories, so I'll let myself do something bad afterwards. I worked very late last night, so I'm not going to work too hard this morning. I'm just going to surf the internet for a couple of hours. The next one is actually from a really famous economics study. So I bought an electric car. Therefore, the people who bought an electric car actually recycled less than they did before they bought the car. I've done something good for the environment. Therefore, I now don't have to do something good for the environment afterwards. I've done my bit. And the final one is a personal example. I got smoking about 15 years ago. While I smoked, I used to go to the gym 5 days a week, do yoga 3 or 4 days a week. As soon as I gave up smoking, I kind of stopped going to the gym so much, stopped doing yoga so much. So because I'd done something really good for my health, I then allowed myself not to do something good for my, to cut out all of the other good things that I was doing. Which I think may explain, if anyone else has the same thing, why people put on weight when they give up smoking. Because it's not just the giving up smoking, it's the giving up of all the good things you were doing to compensate for the fact that you smoked. So just because we believe something or we know something to be true doesn't mean that we will actually behave in that particular way. So we know that we shouldn't smoke, we know we shouldn't drink too much alcohol, we know we should watch more documentaries rather than just crap TV. But just because we know something doesn't mean that we will change our behavior. So we all exist with this contradiction of knowing stuff that we should do and not doing it. So that's the second myth, that changing someone's mind, making them believe something different, will actually have an effect on their behavior. And quite often that's not the case. The final one is about stated versus revealed preferences. So this is this idea that when we tell people why we do something, that we actually know why we did it. So there's lots of hidden influences and hidden things that are actually acting on our behavior all of the time. And we don't know that they're happening. So a very famous study done in the UK in a wine shop. They did it for 2 weeks. And one day they played German music and the next day they played French music. And they just did that over and over again for 2 weeks. So one day German music, one day French music. So when they played German music, they got something like a 15 or 16% increase in sales of German wine. And on the day when they played French music, they got an increase of something like 30 or 32% of people buying French wine. And that happened every day that they ran the experiment. And then when the people came out of the shop and they asked them why they bought that particular bottle of wine, not one person mentioned because of the music. But the music, that was the only thing that changed in the experiment. So there are lots of these things that act on us, these influences in why we do what we do, that we are completely unaware of. And when we're asked why we did it, we will make up a story. Oh, I like the bottle. Oh, I like the fact it had a cork. Oh, I like the pretty picture of the house on it. Oh, I picked a lesser known one because it makes me seem interesting. But actually, the main influence on a lot of the behavior was the music playing in the wine shop. The whole thing with behavioral economics is that making choices is really hard. And we try and avoid making choices or thinking about things rationally when we have that opportunity. And the more complex those choices are, the less likely we are to do something, and we will just follow along with what has been chosen. And that's called the default path. So anytime you're looking at changing behavior, you just have to figure out what is the default now, because that is what people will mostly follow. And if you can change the defaults, you will therefore change the behavior. One little example, because it's a wine-related example. I have a few of them. So this was an experiment, again, done in the UK, looking at how people purchase wine by the glass in a restaurant. So obviously this doesn't work if you have particular preferences, if you know what wine you like, or if you are experienced in choosing wine, or you work in the wine industry, etc. This is just for normal people who are buying a glass of wine. So what most people don't do is buy the house wine. So the cheapest wine, most people will not do that. Maybe you don't want to look like a cheapskate in front of your friends. Maybe you want to impress the date you're on or whatever. So what most people tend to do when they look at a wine list is buy wine A or wine B. So they'll buy the second or third option on the list. So what I said there about default, so this is the default now. So people will not choose the first wine, they'll choose the second or third wine on the list. However, I probably can't answer it, but what would happen if you reversed the wine list? So instead of having the cheapest option at the front, you now have the most expensive option at the top of the wine list. So what you would expect people to do in a rational way is to go down and buy exactly the same glass of wine, the 6th or 7th now on the list, that they had bought when the wine list was ordered the other one. But actually what happens is most people do exactly the same thing they did before. So they don't buy the most expensive wine, but they will buy the 3rd or 4th option on the list. So just simply reversing the wine list, changing the default option, will actually make people buy a glass of wine that is £1 or £2 more expensive than they would have if the wine list was ordered the other way. So what is chosen for us as the default, in this case, the wine list order, is what people's behavior will not change. They will do the same thing. They will just choose the same thing they do, not the top one, but one of the ones that's 3 or 4 down. So I've said we don't make decisions rationally. I said, changing people's minds doesn't change behavior necessarily. So how do we make decisions? What are some of the factors that go into it? And those kind of things are nudges. So what's happening in the environment, what's happening around us, our own self-conception, who we think of. Do I think I'm a sophisticated person? Do I think I'm one of the guys, et cetera, et cetera. So our own self-conception will have a big play in what we do. We tend to follow along with what our friends are doing. It's easier to let our friends make decisions for us than to make it ourselves. We look at triggers in the environment, so adverts, etc. Feelings. So most of the time when we make a decision, it's an actual feeling we have. This feels right. This feels good. So a lot of the time our decision making is emotional, and stories. So we're a very storytelling species. We like to have a narrative and to explain how everything fits into that narrative, to have characters, etc. So a lot of our decision making is based on the stories that we tell ourselves. What we don't tend to do is think about all of our decisions in a very rational, considered, cost-benefit analysis kind of way. I should point out at this point, none of this is bad. It seems like we should all be rational, we should all be making these rational decisions, but actually it's an excellent way to live your life, is to have these kind of things nudging you in a certain direction, and 90% of the time, 99% of the time, it will give you good information. So the example I always use, I've said there that we should do what other people are doing or what our friends are doing. So if you're walking down the street and you see 100 people running the other way, your first instinct shouldn't be, I'll go and check out what they're running away from. So you should probably turn around and run as well. That's excellent advice. So just because all of these things are happening to us, just because we're being influenced by things in our environment, most of the time it's an excellent way to do things. It's a good thing because it doesn't take up too much of our thinking. We can save all of that energy for thinking about more important things. So let me talk about what some of these nudges are, some of these environmental factors that go into how people make decisions. So the first one I'll have a look at is reciprocity. And reciprocity is about giving behavior. So who gives, when they give, and what they give. So here's a really good example. So I think Costco are here in Australia as well. And Costco are famous for a couple of things. One is big bulk items, and 2, you have to have a membership. And number 3, what they're incredibly famous for is giving out free samples. So Costco, when you walk in there, will give you a sample of a little sausage, or they'll give you a bit of cheese, or they'll give you some beer, or a small glass of wine, or a slice of pizza, etc. And so some psychologists studied what happens when you are given a sample of something, and then what does that affect your purchasing? How does that affect your purchasing decision? So if you're given a little beaker of beer or a small glass of beer, then 75% more people buy the beer afterwards. If you were given a small glass of wine, then they get 3 times more sales of wine in the shop. And the final one, if you're given a slice of pizza, 6 times more pizza is sold when you're given the slice of pizza. So hopefully you can see how this is useful. If you think about cellar doors, if you give people a free small sample of wine, then they're much more likely to feel the obligation to buy a bottle of wine back off you. And this is what reciprocity is about. Reciprocity is about, I have done something for you, therefore you will feel an obligation to pay me back or to give me something in return. If you invite me to a party and I bring you a bottle of wine to that party, then I will feel an obligation to invite you back to my party, and you will feel an obligation to bring me a bottle of wine. Anyone who's lived in the UK is familiar with the principle of Browns. It's reciprocity. I bought the last round, it's your turn to buy it next. And we all have these ways of keeping track in our heads of who's bought what and who doesn't. And they're all examples of this principle of reciprocity. So what is it? We're obligated to give back what has been done for us, okay? And one of the really important things about reciprocity, and I'll talk about this in a minute, is it's activated by the person going first. Reciprocity is not cooperation. Cooperation is if you do something for me, I will do something in return. Reciprocity is I have already done something for you, therefore you will feel a need to give something back to me. So reciprocity is activated when somebody does something nice for you, does something good for you. And it doesn't have to be money. It can be favors, it can be information, trust, empathy, sitting down and talking to somebody, giving you my time, helping you with a task, etc., etc., etc. So reciprocity, the person who goes first, that creates the obligation to have something done in return. So if I help you out on a project that you're working on, if I need your help and ask for it later, you will feel an obligation to help me back with you. So first little activity here. So a psychologist I used to work for did a big study in the 1990s at the Holiday Inn chain all across Arizona. And what he was trying to do is get people to reuse their towels. Because when you think about it, it's slightly strange. If you're at home, you'll probably use your towel, a week before you wash it. Maybe some people wash it every day. But if you're in a hotel, you'll happily use the hotel's towels the whole time. So he wanted to help save the environment, to use less detergent, to do less washing in the hotel chain by convincing customers to reuse their towels at least once during this day. So yeah, not to use a new towel every day. So this is the door hanger that was originally there. So if you could please reuse the towels, help save the environment, respecting for nature, save the environment, etc., etc. Your normal kind of informational message. So what I'd like you all to do is, now that you know about reciprocity, I have done something for you, therefore you owe me something in return. What message would you put on that door hanger using this idea of reciprocity, this idea of obligation, to help people to recycle their towels, to use their towels again, at least once during this day? So answers in the chat box, if you don't mind. Just a sentence, that's all it is. All it needs is a sentence to use reciprocity to get people to recycle towels. I'll give you a minute to do that. Waiting for Q&As to pop up. Okay, some good ones coming up there. Drink voucher would work, I'm pretty sure. We have given you a free drink voucher in the expectation that you will recycle your towel. Yeah. Right, £5 off a booking tonight is not reciprocity, that's cooperation. We will give you, if you recycle your towel, we will give you $5 off. That's cooperation. If you wanted to make it reciprocity, you would say, we have already given you $5 off your booking this night from what we initially said, in the expectation that you do your towel. That would make it reciprocity. A credit on your account, again, that's cooperation, not reciprocity. That's saying, we will give you this credit if you do something for me first. Remember, reciprocity is about who goes first. I'll come back to that cellar door question in a minute, because I'm curious to run that study if anyone wants to run it with me. Any others before I reveal the answers? Okay. So they actually tried a couple of experiments here. One was exactly what we've been talking about, which is that cooperation study. So if you recycle your towel, we will make a donation to a charity on behalf of the guests in the hotel. And the second one was an actual reciprocity one. We have already made a donation to a charity on behalf of our guests in the hotel. And this is what they found. So in the environmental appeal, so the normal kind of like informational, we need to save the planet, we need to save the environment, please help the polar bears. they got 35% of people who would reuse their towel at least once during their stay. In the cooperation one, which is we will make a donation to an environmental charity on behalf of this hotel if you recycle your towel, it actually reduced the amount of people who recycled their towel. And in the reciprocity one, we have already made a donation on behalf of this hotel and its guests. 45% of people, so not quite half of the people, recycle their towel at least once during their stay. So apart from the fact that I find it quite interesting that it's not even something for them, it's something for an environmental charity, it's still got, you know, a significant 10% increase in people recycling their towels. But I wanted to make that point about how reciprocity is different to cooperation. So cooperation in this case, you know, if you want someone to do something, you have to offer them a bigger reward than just donating to a charity. But if you've already done it, if you've done it first, then it will have a more significant impact. So going back to that question about celladors that are charging for their small glass of wine, my hypothesis would be that it is actually it's less effective at getting people to buy the bottle of wine afterwards, and they're probably better off not doing it. But it would be a really interesting and simple study. So if anyone out there would like to do that study with me, I'm sure we can find a graduate student somewhere who would help us. And yeah, I'd love to try that out in a cellador somewhere. So. Okay, reciprocity. The other thing about reciprocity is that you need to tell people what you want in return. So quite often, you know, we will do something for someone and they will say, "Oh, that's really nice of you." We'll go, "Oh, don't worry about it. That's fine." That doesn't make reciprocity happen. So for reciprocity to happen, you have to say what you want in return. So in the case of this particular experiment, it was, you know, if, you know, we have already donated on behalf of this hotel and its guests, in the expectation that you will recycle your towel. So if you're using reciprocity, you have to tell people what you want afterwards. But quite often, culturally, we don't like to ask for things that we want, even if we've done something really nice for somebody. If you don't want anything in return, or you don't want to ask for anything, then you say something like, "I'm sure you would do the same thing for me in return." So you don't have to specify a particular gift. Or you can do what's called paying it forward. I've seen a few cafes here that do the pay it forward thing. So, you know, you make a donation, you know, you give it to somebody else who's in need or whatever. So there are other ways that you can make sure that reciprocity happens. But if you don't say anything, then it won't invoke this rule of reciprocity. Okay. So that's reciprocity. There's more to it, but I think that's good enough. And you'll see how we've used it in the case study a little bit later as well. The second thing I want to talk about is authority. So our tendency to do what people who we believe are credible experts or people who are in authority tell us to do or ask us to do. And the most important part about authority is the source of the influence, the source of the authority comes from being perceived as being an authority figure. It doesn't necessarily someone who is in authority. And there's a classic example of this in the UK, where they got the Surgeon General of the UK to front a campaign to get people to check their cholesterol, so get the pinprick and check their cholesterol. It wasn't particularly successful until they got George Clooney, who at that time was at the height of his fame in ER, dressed in his scrubs to front the campaign. And then they had a huge increase in people responding to the campaign. So it's not actually being an authority, because the actual authority here is the Surgeon General. He's an actual doctor. It's the perception of being an authority. In this case, George Clooney, very popular. People perceive him to be a doctor, even if he isn't actually a doctor. So it's not about being an actual authority. It's not having actual expertise. It's just about the perception of being an authority. So here's a little case study we did at a London real estate agent when I worked in the UK. So they had a switchboard. They did residential and they did commercial properties. They had a switchboard where people would phone in with an inquiry about needing office space or wanting a new house or whatever. And we asked the receptionist to give people an introduction. So to have an authority message when they put the person through on the call. Anyone guess what, again, in the Q&A, just quickly say, what could we ask her to say that would help to increase the credibility of the person she was putting them through to? Give you a minute again, just in the Q&A there, just drop in, what do you think we would ask the receptionist to say before she puts someone through to a salesperson in the real estate agency? Okay, answer is correct first up. So yeah, exactly. So we said this person has X amount of experience at dealing with inquiries like yours. Okay, so this person has 20 years experience in commercial sales, or this person has 20 years experience in residential sales, etc. Yeah, so you're all there along the right tracks. The more specific you are, the better the authority message will work. So 20 years experience selling properties in this area is true. Absolutely true as well. So, if they put them through to one person, we told them to say exactly how many, we had a list of how many years experience that person had, etc. So all honest communication, there was nothing wrong with it. And here's what we found when we did the study. So this is the percentage increase compared to not having that introduction. So the receptionist is saying, I'm going to put you through to somebody in that team. And we have appointments that were confirmed from that telephone inquiry. And then finally, the customers who actually appointed the agency, if they had had the introduction compared to when they hadn't. So almost 20% more people confirmed to meet with the agent after they had had the credibility introduction. And about 15% more actually appointed the agency than when they hadn't had the introduction, which is actually quite a significant gain just for one sentence difference. So I said earlier, when Prue introduced me, this is a really good way to credentialize yourself. It works better when it comes from other people. And if you think about it, it's quite bizarre because in this case, it's coming from somebody from the same company. So they have a vested interest in the company doing well. But even when that person may be biased, it still has an impact on what people do afterwards. Or even if there could be the perception of bias. Okay, so that's authority messages. Just jot down in the Q&A now where you see authority messages. You actually see them quite often. Just have a quick think about where you've seen these authority messages. So I'll give one example. So if you buy a book, you will see that other famous authors have recommended that book. So there'll be testimonials. So testimonials from perceived experts is one way. Can anyone think of any other ways or any other places that you see these kind of authority messages? Yes, wine reviews. Yeah, TripAdvisor also has social proof going on. So lots of people do this. So that's slightly different, but yeah. So yeah, wine experts, sommeliers, etc. They're all authority messages. Yeah. If you go to the Apple store, they call them Apple geniuses. Not just any shop assistant. These people are geniuses. So that's a type of authority message. Online influencers. So they are. That's an appeal to expertise. So whenever you see online influencers, people who are really good at doing makeup or whatever it might be, that's a type of authority message. They're a credible expert in whatever field you think they are, whatever field they work in. Okay. So the final one I wanted to quickly talk about is this idea of similarity. Humans very much like people who are similar to us, that share a similar name, a similar upbringing, a similar background, similar education, etc. You've probably all noticed, there's lots of studies of this, that if you go to any particular large city, you will see that all of the ethnic clusters tend to be in the same area. So you have the Chinese portion, etc. You have the Australians in Earl's Court in London. You have people of similar tend to flock together, apart from Germans. So the one group of people who didn't do it in the experiment were Germans, and no one knows why. There's no Germantown in London. So that's an example of similarity. We like to be around people who we think are similar to us. When you first meet someone, you'll probably ask two or three questions, which is one, who are you? What's your name? Two, what do you do? And then possibly something around sport or some kind of interest. The person who shares the most similarities with you, that's the person you will talk to. If it doesn't happen, then you move on to somebody else until you find the most similar people to you in the room. That's what most people do. Okay, so we will do things for people who share an interest, similar background, education, etc. So, I'll cut that out. Right, so here's a really interesting experiment on this, and it's about, we don't just like people who are similar to us, we like people who are similar to us and share a really uncommon commonality. So something that we both do that nobody else does, or is very rare. So, you know, if we're both into water skiing or if we're both into parachuting or whatever, the more rare the similarity we share, the more likely we are to help someone or to do something for them. So there's a really nice little experiment about this, which is they had two people come into a lab and they took their fingerprints at the start and then they had to sit and complete a questionnaire. So sometimes the experimenter said, oh, that's interesting, you two have very similar fingerprints, but you know, it's very common. A lot of people have that type of fingerprint. It's a complete lie, by the way, you know, there is no kind of similarity in fingerprints, but it was a good way to do the experiment. And other times people were told, oh, wow, you two have exactly the same type of fingerprint, and it's really rare. Only about 2% of people have that kind of fingerprint. Very, very uncommon, very rare to find. Then on the way out, one of the people who was in the experiment was working with the experimenter. He was a Confederate. And he asked the guy as they were walking out, oh, I've just got this essay that I have to hand in next week. Would you mind having a look over it for me to see if you find it persuasive, to see if it's logically structured, to see if you like it, etc. And then they just tested the amount of people who would actually stop and help the guy with his essay. So look it over for him and give him some feedback. And here's what they found in terms of complying with that request. If it was a general request, so nothing was mentioned about fingerprints, there were just two guys who were sitting there doing a questionnaire, about 50% of people helped, which I think is quite nice, actually. So it means if you ask a complete stranger for help with something, then about 50% of the people will say yes. So that's actually quite a nice psychology finding. If you were told that the fingerprints were, oh, wow, you have identical fingerprints, they're very common. Lots of people have that type of fingerprint. Then you've got a very slight increase in people helping you. So an extra 5% of people will stop and help you to fill in your essay. But look what happens when you are told that you have a very rare fingerprint. Only 2% of the population have that kind of fingerprint. Suddenly 80% of people will stop and help the guy to complete his essay. So we like people who are similar to us. We like people who share commonalities with us. And we particularly like people who share very uncommon or very rare hobbies or commonalities with us. I did this course I was in Singapore for a group, and the guy there had, he'd done a course in organ tuning for churches in Durham in the UK. And only about 10 or 12 people are trained per year to do that. And he said he got a flight over to Singapore years later, and he was chatting to one of the cabin assistants who had actually done exactly the same course as him. And it was such a rare thing, you know, so few people are actually trained to be organ tuners in churches, that the guy gave him an upgrade. There was a free seat in first class, and the guy took him up to first class, just because they shared that incredibly rare kind of background skill. So that's the three techniques. There are many, many more. There are lots and lots of other things. So these are just three of the main kind of ones that seem to be universal. So regardless of culture, etc., people will tend to reciprocity, authority, and similarity will work across cultures for you to different levels. So, you know, some cultures are much more into gift giving and reciprocity, etc., but all of them will work in some way for you. So now I want to talk a little bit about the application. So it's all well and good to have it, you know, in a lab or to read all the books on it, but how does it work in real life? There's a couple of things I want to just bring out in terms of the work I have done in the past. So the best piece of advice I ever got, I used to work for a very famous psychologist in his field called Robert Cialdini, who wrote a book in the 80s about influence and persuasion. And he's the one who ran that experiment in Arizona at the Holiday Inn hotel chain. And this is what he told me, and I've never forgotten it because it's a really good point. He said, never try and force a persuasion technique into the situation. Every single situation will have something that's happening there already. And your job as a kind of behavioral psychologist is to find what's already happening and then pull that out. So if we go back to the example of the cellar door, reciprocity is already happening in the situation. I don't need to try and force something. I don't need to use an authority message. I don't need to use a similarity message because reciprocity is there. What I need to do is tell people how reciprocity works, bring it out, make it more obvious what you want in return, work on some of the wording, how that happens, etc. So if you sit and look at the situation long enough, if you look at the process, if you look at what's happening, then you'll be able to find that influence that's already there and bring it to the surface. Bring it out, make it stronger, make it work better, enhance it. I'll give you an example of that, exactly that, in a minute from my case study. So related to that is this idea that it's not just about going out and writing messages or writing communications. It's about mapping out the whole process. And a lot of behavioral economists, people like me, use data a lot. So we look at what is happening. So in this case, this isn't one of mine, this is from a friend of mine. And he was looking at getting prescriptions from the chemist, how long it takes, what you need to provide, etc. So mapping out that entire process. How long does it take to go in? What do I need to give to the person? A lot of behavioral psychologists do work on making forms easier to complete, making it more logical, etc. And looking at what the data tells us. So, 50% of people have to wait 30 minutes for their prescription, 10% of how different is that with different medications, etc., etc. Then, how are people more likely to use the medication? Will they stick to the medication? Do we want them to stick to the medication? Etc., etc. So look at the data, look at what it's telling you about, map out the process, then look at what the data is telling you about that situation. And then when you've done all that, you can start to look at what are some of the unconscious things that are going on in that process. So optimism bias here, or emotion, etc., etc. So, and then you can start to put in things that will either enhance it or dampen it, depending on what you're looking to do. So there's two things. So map the process, find out what's actually happening in the situation, find out what the influence is, what is the psychology that's at work, and then enhance it or dampen it down if it's something that you don't want to happen. So that's more about the art. The reason I'm so interested is that I think that in a lot of times, because we assume that everyone's rational, we assume that people are going to, do what we want them to or do the right thing in certain circumstances. So we tend to build communications and build change programs and build projects that don't take note of the fact that our brains are limited, that we do things in an automatic way, that environment is just as important as actual words or actual communication. So I think we can actually start to build better projects that work with our behaviors, not against it, that don't make assumptions about how rational we are and how we do things. So that's kind of how I think about the work that I do. So here's a case study, a quick example of one of the projects I did. This took about 3 months to complete and then another 3 months for the data to come back in. And I'll explain why it took that long for the data in a minute. So Anglian Water is one of the UK's largest water providers. It's based around Norwich in Cambridgeshire. So Norwich and Cambridgeshire, so it's a fairly large geographical area that they covered. So there's a government regulator who regulates the water industry called Ofwat, and they do a customer survey every 3 months. So they will ring up people who have been visited by plumbers or have interacted with the call center, and they will ask them how they like the experience, etc. So over time, Anglian Water had figured out who was going to get called. I can't remember exactly how they figured it out, but they were gaming the system, basically. So they knew who was going to get called, and they made sure that that person had a fantastic experience. And so they were actually, for many years, the second. They had been the second highest rated water supplier. And because the government changed how they did the survey, they did it in a different way, and suddenly they slipped from second to 8th. Out of the 12 water providers in the UK. And this was actually quite important to their business because the better you rated on the survey, it directly affected how much they could set for water prices, so they couldn't give as big discounts. And also they weren't invited to sit on government panels about the water industry. So only like the top 4 or 5 water utilities were sat on government panels. So they actually lost quite a lot of political credibility by slipping that far down as well. So they called us in to look at what we could do to increase their customer survey skills. So what we were asked to do was to develop a customer service strategy to use behaviour science to increase their service scores, train all call centre and field staff in maximising the effectiveness of their interventions. So when they're out of the house, what should they do? What should they say? When they call into the call centre, what should they do? What should they say? How should they think about it? We did a big workshop for all of their senior managers, and we had a cartoonist, so I've got some of the cartoons here as well. And then finally, there was this little weird quirk that when someone called out a plumber, so there was something wrong with their pipes or something wrong with their water supply, and about half the time they visited, nobody was home, which is quite strange. You would think that people would be there, but you know, they're booked 2 weeks in advance. Sometimes people forgot, sometimes people you know, had to go out or whatever. But still, it was 50% of the time they couldn't actually fix the problem, and they'd have to book a repeat visit and go back. So costing them, and also not very good customer service. So here's what we did. So I went out for a week with the plumbers, went on their jobs with them, looked at what they were doing, you know, talked to the customers. How did they find it? What was the issue? How did they go into the, you know, how did they find the call to the call center? Did all of that kind of background work, mapped out the process of how the things worked, listened to about 120 customer calls. So looked at, you know, how we could script them better, how we could use the behavioral science to get people to commit to being there. And one of the things I discovered when I was out with a plumber was he went to a house and he fixed the fault in the toilet. And then he noticed that she had a lot of pot plants in her home. And so he went back to his van and he took out a small pot plant thing that sat at the bottom of a pot plant and helped. You needed less water, so it absorbed the water so that the plant didn't need to be watered as often. So he went to the woman. He said, "I noticed you have a lot of pot plants in your house. I'll give you some of these that you can put in your pot plants, and then you'll only have to water them every 3 days or every 4 days or whatever it was." So just quickly in the box, I want you to all type in what was going on here. So of the techniques I've explained, what was he doing? This should be a fairly easy question to answer. So what was the guy doing? He'd gone in, he'd noticed that she had pot plants, and he gave her something to help with the pot plants, to help her to water them less. So just in the chat box, tell me what you think he was doing. Of the techniques I've described, there were 3 earlier in the presentation. Which technique was he half doing here? I'm guessing nobody understands the question. Okay, so he was half doing reciprocity. So he was giving her a gift. He was saying, here you go, here's something nice for you. There we go. So a couple of people have put it in there. But what he wasn't doing is telling her what he wanted in return. So he was only doing half of the reciprocity. He was giving her this gift, but he wasn't saying, and if anyone calls you to ask about the customer service, then I'm sure you'll say nice things about Anglian water. So I realized that it was brilliant, you know, and it was there. Like I said earlier, it's like, you know, if you wait and watch long enough, you'll find the influence technique that's already in the situation. So I went back to the senior managers and I said, you know, where did this guy get these little pot plant holder things from? And the guy said, oh, it was a campaign we did about 2 years ago. We have about 1 million of them in storage. So we stuck, you know, all of these things onto people's vans and told them, if you notice any pot plants in the house at all, make sure that you give this pot plant holder thing out to them, and make sure that you tell them that if Ofwat calls or if somebody calls about their customer service, I'm sure you'll say really nice things. So that was the first intervention, a reciprocity intervention, where we gave the customer a gift and then we told them what we would like in return for that gift. So the second one was authority. Okay, so what we did is we had all of these plumbers and realized that they all had these plumbing qualifications. So we had name badges printed up and we had little cards to say, you know, this is my name, this is my qualifications. So we listed out their plumbing qualifications on the thing. And on that card, it said how many years experience they had had fixing faults. So they would hand the card to the customer. And again, this is an authority message. So it says, you know, I'm not just anybody turning up to fix your pipes. I'm someone who is well qualified, well credentialed, and very experienced. It also had the unintended consequence, which I didn't realize at the time, which was that the plumbers loved it. The plumbers were like, finally, someone recognizes our qualifications and our skills, and that we're not just guys who drive around on vans. So actually, it had a really good internal motivation component as well, which hadn't occurred to me when I was doing it. Okay, so they were the two main interventions. There were some smaller ones. We did some work in the call center and wrote them kind of behavioural informed scripts, etc. And what happened is over the next 6 months, so 2 Ofwat scores surveys, they went from 8th back up to 2nd. I'm not sure what happened after that. We didn't track it more than those next 2 Ofwat surveys, but just those 2 small interventions, an authority message and reciprocity message, moved the company up from 8th to 2nd. So one thing still outstanding is, how did we get people to be at home when people came to visit? So we've done reciprocity, we've done authority. There was one other technique. So that was similarity, people like us, etc. So again, in the chat box, if you want to try and tell me, what do you think we could do? How do you think we could help people to make sure they stayed at home? Any ideas? So remember, we're emailing out a confirmation, so I'll give you that much. When we emailed out the confirmation, what did we change on the confirmation to make people more likely to be at home when the plumber came to visit? Oh, I can see your response there, Sandy, so I don't think it is disabled. I also think I might have told you the answer to this question at some point. So discount off, again, that might be depending on how you do it, that could be reciprocity or, sorry, I meant the Q&A, that's fine. Whichever box you can type in. So yeah, so discount off might work, but again, it's not reciprocity, it would be cooperation. So it would depend on how you did it. We didn't actually use reciprocity, we used a similarity message, a very, very basic similarity message. Any other thoughts or? No. Okay, so I'll give you the answer. So all we did was put a picture of the person into the confirmation email. So when you're sitting at home, if you don't know who's turning up, you don't have an idea, you can't picture that person in your head, then it's very easy just to go out shopping or to forget about it, etc. If you can actually see a picture of the person who is coming to visit you, then you're much more likely to think it's an actual human being. It's somebody like me, somebody who works, someone who does something. We also put an authority message into it saying, and this person has 10 years experience fixing plumbing issues like yours. So just those 2 small interventions, a picture of the person who's coming to fix their pipes, and then an authority message. We got it from 50% of people being home up to 84% people being at home. So that's your very quick guide to the science and art of behavioral science and behavioral economics. So I guess now, if anyone has any questions, we have a bit of time to take some questions, and I can do my best to answer them for you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, James. And yeah, please feel free to type those questions into the Q&A button there. Certainly some ideas were spinning through my head about potential projects and research that you could be doing in the wine space, James. With that whole wine list in a restaurant, I was thinking, in a cellar door setting, yes, the charging versus free tastings would be interesting, but another element to that would be, does the positioning of the wines for sale on a cellar door price list impact purchasing behaviour?
Has a huge impact. Yeah. It's called a contrast effect. So what you see first will influence your subsequent decisions. So,
okay, so even in an environment like a cellar door where someone has just been through a tasting, they should have received some form of education on what the wines were, and therefore a little bit more confident about what they liked and what they want to purchase. Those factors don't impact that theory?
They will have a small impact for some people, but no impact for most people. I think it's probably the answer. But yeah, so the classic example is in the 50s and 60s, expensive watches. Yep. So they had like a really expensive watch at one end. They had, at the start, then the middle price watch, then the cheapest watch. What they found is that most people would buy the middle price watch. So no one bought the most expensive one, and no one bought the cheapest one. They bought the middle one. But if you take the really expensive option away, then everyone suddenly buys the cheapest one.
Yeah, right.
So what's happening is that you're being anchored. You're seeing that first thing you see is like, that's really expensive, but this looks much more cheap in comparison to that. But when you take that comparison away, then people are making a different comparative judgment. So you should always have the most expensive bottle of wine, then the middle, then the cheapest.
Excellent, great tip. And have you done any work on, obviously, sustainability in the wine industry is a huge topic and something everyone's wanting to get on board with. And there's that whole people behaviour side of things to, I guess, getting the staff in wine businesses on board for that. Have you done any work in that space or can comment on that, I guess, project?
A tiny bit. I've only been here a few months, but I think that's going to be a large part of my job going forward. And again, it's about communication. And going back to the similarity message, one of the things I say quite often is you get them to influence each other. So it's not about me trying to influence them, it's about trying to get them to influence each other. So knowing the kind of language they use, how they speak to each other, what kind of interests them. So you have to do it from their perspective, not from your own. But I'll give you an example. So I was talking to Alex, who I work with a few weeks ago, about using less water in vineyards.
Yes.
And I was saying, instead of telling people how much money they can save, etc., there's a thing in behavioral economics called the endowment effect. So things that we already own, things that are ours, we think are more valuable than that same thing if it's somebody else's or if it's just in a shop, etc. So as soon as you buy an object, it's suddenly worth more than you actually paid for it because now it's mine. We really like it. Yeah. So I told him we could do a thing where instead of telling people how much money they'll save, you tell them how much they're losing. This is your water you're losing. That's really bad. This is something you own and now it's just disappearing. It's going somewhere. So you can use kind of, just simple things like that, changing around how you do the messaging. Again, it's something I'd like to test rather than just do it. But certainly from the behavioral science point of view, it should work quite effectively. They did an experiment on something very similar with energy consumption. So instead of telling, to get people to insulate their houses. So instead of telling people how much money they could save, they just told them how much heat they were losing from each room of the house. So if you're not insulated, you're losing 5% of the heat in your house from your living room. You're losing 3% from your kitchen, etc. And that was actually much more successful at getting people to buy insulation than telling them how much money they'd save on heating.
Absolutely. James, we've got a couple of questions that have come through. So the first one is, when someone switches away from a brand, does that mean their default has potentially changed rather than changing their mind? Excellent question.
It could be a lot of things. I don't, brand loyalty works by repetition. So seeing it all the time, having it all the time, etc. And it may just be that something's been repeated more, or you've had a bad experience with it, or a friend of yours has had a bad experience and told you about it. So therefore you avoid doing it. So yes, I don't think there's one easy answer to that particular question. And also a lot of these things, probably worth saying, if you have a really strong preference in a certain direction, then it's not going to work on you. So, if you're really into wines, you know what you want, you know what you like, no behavioral trick is going to get you to switch that over. When I first started doing this, I worked for TV licensing in the UK, and they're the people who get all the funding for the BBC. So they have a call center, and so everyone has to pay their license if they own a TV, etc. So we were looking at ways that we could get people to pay their licenses, and we had this like 7% of people who are like hard refusers. So they own a TV, but they just refuse to pay the license. They just feel like it's morally upsets them or whatever it is. And we got these behavioral change experts in, who I eventually went to work for, and said, I was finally, how are we going to get these people, etc. And he said to me, it's like, just ignore them. There's nothing you can do. They have this very strong preference. They don't want to change. They don't want to do anything. And so there's nothing you can do about them. And I think the same about climate skeptics as well. Stop trying to talk to them. You're not going to convince them. You're not going to change their mind. Work on that middle tranche of people who, for whatever reasons, they're busy, they're forgetful, they don't know how to recycle, they don't have the, work on those people. Just ignore the rest of them. There's nothing you can do, and you'll just waste your time.
Yeah. A couple more wine-specific questions for you. How would you incentivize customers to join a mailing list, or preferably a wine club? So I guess applying those key principles you've talked about and using the right language to get people over the line. It's a great question.
So it's different. Online persuasion is different to in-person persuasion. So, if you're signing people up on an actual list, then you can do lots of fun things like, if you go door to door and you show people that their neighbors have already signed up, then they're much more likely to do it. Or if you just show there's a lot of people going, or you can have scarcity effects. So, time is running out, you can only get this offer now. So scarcity effects are quite common in that kind of environment. Online, it's about commitment. It's about getting people to click through. So the more clicks you have, there's an art to it, but you have to have a certain amount of clicks to make people, I've gone this far, I may as well go further, etc. So it depends, and it depends on the different audiences. Writing things in their language. So I used to work at a bank in Ireland. I was their behavioural economist, and I used to work for the arrears team. And the arrears team chased up people who hadn't paid their mortgage that month or whatever. And they used to write these letters that said, you are now in arrears on your mortgage, etc., etc. And they wouldn't change their letter for me. So I went and did a Google Analytics thing, and the #1 search term on arrears in Ireland was "what is arrears?" So they were literally writing letters out to people, and they had no idea what they were talking about. I mean, literally didn't know. And people in banks assume that people know how to calculate interest, and most people don't. Only people who are really financially literate do. So we went and scraped a load of websites. We looked at kind of where debt management, people who are in debt, where they went to ask questions, to financial advice websites and stuff like that. And the words that people used were, how do I come to an arrangement with the bank? I don't think I'm going to be able to pay my mortgage this month. Will the bank come to an arrangement with me? Will they have an arrangement? So we just used that in the letters. We just said, if you call us now, we will come to an arrangement with you about that. And we got like 20 or 30% more people who would phone in before they missed their payment. So I think a lot of it is about that personalization. I understand how you think. It's that similarity thing again around, we know how you think, we know the words you use, we are like you, therefore you should call us.
Great.
So and that kind of thing. Don't use wine language if you want people who aren't wine people to buy it,
Yeah, interesting, because I guess the advantage of like wine businesses that have a cellar door, they have that opportunity for that face-to-face sale. And I don't know if you've got any comments on language they would use in that face-to-face scenario. People have just finished a tasting, and the manager has told them, try and upsell them to join the wine club or join our mailing list. How would you go about that?
I have seen I went to a wine tasting in Tasmania at a cellar door, and they had like a little comments book where people could write comments in. So I think that does two things for you. One, it tells you lots of people come here. So it's a social proof message. This is popular because look, we've got 3/4 of this wine book filled. People from your country have come, it's in your language, etc. But also it will get you some of those words, those persuasive words that people are using. So I think just something as simple as having that kind of book there, and then using it, to say, look, see how popular you are because lots of people filled it in. Then also looking at some of those comments and saying, okay, what are the key words that are coming out? What are the things, the similarities you're seeing? And then put that into your wine advertising. So I think that's a really easy and simple thing you can do just to improve that experience.
Absolutely. We've got a couple more questions, so I'm going to keep them moving as time is running out for us. Outside of a cellar door, e.g. online sales, what would you suggest to engage in, I still can't say it,
reciprocity. It's a tricky one.
With existing or new customers?
So again, reciprocity is about giving people things. And like I said, it doesn't have to be money, it can be praise. There's kind of a related effect where if you get them to give something to you, so feedback or praise or whatever, then they're more likely to come and buy again as well. So finding some way to make the interaction two-way is always useful. Again, it depends on the particular circumstances. So, and what you can give, I get a lot of pushback with reciprocity about you're bribing people, etc. So it depends what you can give and how you can give it. But,
Okay.
but yeah, just think about any gifts you can give. And like I said, it's not about if you do this, we will send you this. It's about we have already done this. If after 11 months, if you send the 12th one free, that's a really good reciprocity idea, or a free bottle of wine with everything you send. But don't tell them, because unexpected reciprocity is much more powerful than expected reciprocity. So just send a free bottle as well. So just because you're a value customer, here's a 13th bottle of wine.
Yep.
That would have a huge impact, I would have thought.
Fantastic. Thank you. Next questions regarding current economic situation. Inflation, increasing price rises, surely is changing buying behaviour. Are there some general statements you can enlighten us with?
Well, it's absolutely true. People are price sensitive. I wouldn't, especially when they don't have a preference. So I don't have a preference in what washing powder I use, so I just buy the one that's on special. So yeah, of course, price is a way of making a decision. So I wouldn't, behavioral economics is not the only lever you have to pull. Legislation is just as powerful as anything I know. If I get 7 or 10% of people doing something differently, I'm thrilled. Whereas banning something or changing the legislation will have a much more powerful impact. So I'm not ignoring all of those things. I'm just saying that there is this whole other category of things that are out there as well that we don't know about, we don't use. So yeah, so I'm not saying that economics is useless or anything. I'm just saying there's these other things that influence behaviors.
So but changing the language using when trying to sell people is something that, wine businesses should be considering in the current.
It's about using their language, not yours. So going back to the idea of similarity, it's about similarities.
Great. And the last question for today, in a situation where a distributor who offers free samples to the trade, i.e. restaurateurs, in order to get them to buy, how do you stand out from all the other distributors who offer the same thing? Restaurants are thinking that by giving you their time to taste the wines, it cancels the reciprocity. How to manage this? Read that. I didn't.
Hang on, I'll have to read this.
Yeah, sorry, a few elements.
You free samples to traders. So giving free samples is good. That's reciprocity in order to get them to buy.
But you're having to compete with everyone else who's giving free samples. How do you? Yeah.
So I think there's a few ways you can make reciprocity more powerful. So one is unexpected rewards. So something that they're not expecting. So if you get it all of the time, the effect fades over time. So if you're used to getting something from somebody, then it just becomes the norm, and people don't do it. So unexpected gifts are much more powerful than ones that are expected. So put some thought into what those are. Personalized gifts, so things that show that you have thought about who that person is and how they're different from other customers. Yeah, exactly. A handwritten note is a perfect example.
I'm just thinking invitation to go visit the winery. It doesn't have to be fully paid for, but just extending the invitation to see, meet the winemaker, etc.
Yeah, exactly. We talked about, I think for Sandy's crush survey, we were talking about, giving something to people if, and one of the things we talked about was, an hour with Martin. He's the head of Wine Australia. He's an authority figure, and his time is valuable, and you could offer that as some kind of reward. So think just a bit differently about what people like, what they enjoy, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. And one very quick last question, because we are going a bit over time. What influence does brand association have in consumer behaviour? I think you might have touched on this.
Yeah, it's not really my strong point. I don't know a lot about brands or branding. Like I said, repetition is a big one, similarity, but yeah, I'm not sure I can give a simple or answer to that one.
Quick answer to that one. Might have to take that one online, and I know you're going to share your contact details at the end.
I will, and what I'll do is I'll send you over some book recommendations. Someone's asked for book recommendations, so I'll send it over to you.
Yes. Great. Perhaps I can include that in the email that goes out tomorrow with a link to the recording, James.
I'll send that to you now. So yeah, so I'll send over some book recommendations. I'll also send over a couple of little videos that might be helpful as well.
Excellent. Well, I think we're going to have to wrap up today. I know we could keep chatting most probably on this topic for hours, but thank you so much for your time.
Just quickly, my email address is just james.west@wineaustralia.com. So if anyone wants to ask any questions or whatever, I'm happy to answer them. So just drop me an email.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who's attended today. WCA's next webinar will be held on Tuesday, the 9th of August. Environmentally friendly winemaking, stories of sustainable survival. So definitely an interesting one. And that's going to be presented by Hamish Ramsey, consultant at SW Sustainability Advisory. Registrations are now live for that one on our events page. For all WCA members, recordings from previous webinars are held on our website and free for you to access under the education section. If you have any suggestions at all on webinar topics you'd like us to cover in next year's program, because this year's program is pretty much full, I'd love to hear from you. wca@winecommunicators.com.au. Thanks again for attending. Thank you, James, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.